Ave Maria in the Afternoon is a co-production of Ave Maria Radio and EWTN Radio and carried across the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. Welcome to Ave Maria in the Afternoon, examining the world through the lens of faith from the heart of the Church to help us navigate the culture. Here's Dr. Marcus Peter.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us on this hour of Ave Maria in the Afternoon. I'm Marcus Peter. American Enterprise Institute put out an article that gave me quite a lot of food for thought. Samuel J. Abrams, he wrote a reflection entitled, "The Good Neighbor Myth is Fading and We Need to Face It." Now, it is a piece that forces you and I to confront a true problem that's facing modern American community, and that is the death of neighborliness. And if you get a little jarred by that, just realize this is the truth. Nearly 50 years ago, the notion of being so intertwined within our local communities that we knew our neighbors by name, we could rely on them, we could trust them for safety and even moral accountability for ourselves, for our children. There was a tremendous amount of safety in letting our children roam and saying, well, come back home before the streetlights come on, and we could trust that they were well. That sense of neighborliness has eroded to almost nothing. There are many reasons for this. And I'll address some of those reasons why this has happened. But I also want to talk about the core thing that facilitated a spirit of neighborliness as a kind of sub-virtue under the exercise of charity and friendship. And that core thing is, no surprise here, the church. Because what churches did before urban sprawl and before overt development took place was it bound small communities and towns together. And it gave the people in that area a common sense of worship, because the friend that you lived next to was also the friend you saw sitting next to you in church. And so they were helping their children join church better, worship better, and that model helped you help your children in worshiping better. And so the friendship was built between your children and their children, and you had a shared sense of creed. And that creed means that you have a transcendental worldview that's greater than just the fact that we live next to each other. So proximity became a factor to play here. We'll talk about all of that. Move on from there to speak with historian Scott Ellsworth. Next summer, the United States celebrates its 250th birthday. And as many of you know, I love this nation and I'm a student of her history. But the truth is, we almost didn't make it as a nation. The Civil War fractured the Union to its core, and especially those last days of the Civil War. We want to talk about what happened and how the hand of Providence led us to have the Union that we have today. All this after the headlines.
Thanks, Marcus. Good afternoon, everyone. This is your Ave Maria Radio News for Monday, August 11th. It's the Feast of St. Clare of Assisi. Today's news brought to you by Visiting Angels, providing loving care and assistance for seniors in need. VisitingAngels.com. The mayor of Washington, D.C. is reacting to President Trump's crime actions in the nation's capital.
And while this action today is unsettling and unprecedented, I can't say that given some of the rhetoric of the past, that we're totally surprised.
Democratic Mayor Muriel Bowser speaking out after Trump placed the D.C. police under federal control and activated the National Guard as a part of his major crackdown on crime. Bowser said she's cooperating with the Trump administration, but adds the president's actions are just a reminder that D.C. should be granted full statehood. The Texas State House has once again failed to reach quorum after Democrats left the state to stop a Republican-led redistricting effort. Texas House Speaker Dustin Burrows addressing the missing Democrats directly this afternoon.
You can go to another city, another state, even another time zone, but you cannot escape your responsibility to the people of Texas. Eventually, you will be here.
The House has been trying to reach quorum since last week. The new maps pushed by President Trump could give the GOP as many as 5 more U.S. House seats. A teenage girl may become the first Catholic saint from Louisiana. Charlene Richard was diagnosed with leukemia when she was 12. She told the hospital chaplain that she wanted to offer her suffering for the sake of others. After her death in 1959, people who visited her grave started reporting miracles of healing. The Diocese of Lafayette and Alexandria submitted a report to the Vatican, which is now considering her case. From your AveMariaRadio.net news desk, I'm Steve Clark.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. The American neighbor was once a staple of both the national imagination and everyday life. Across the rural plains and small towns, and even in the early suburbs, neighbor meant more than the person living next door. It meant the one you knew by name. The one who might lend you a cup of sugar, watch your children for an afternoon, bring over soup when sickness struck. It was a web of trust, familiarity, and shared moral expectations. A quiet but powerful force that undergirded family life, community stability, and national cohesion. In short, we saw its value, and so we worked for neighborly friendliness. Samuel J. Abrams' reflection in The Good Neighbor Myth is Fading, and We Need to Face It. This is an article on American Enterprise Institute. Forces us to acknowledge that while many Americans still act as good neighbors in small ways, the societal infrastructure that nurtured and sustained neighborliness has been quietly dismantled over decades. The pressing question here is whether it can be rebuilt, and if so, from where? Now, you know where I'm going to go with this, because the roots of this ideal run deep in the Judeo-Christian tradition. In the Torah, God commands his people, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. For Israel, neighbor was not an abstract citizen, but a real proximate person, a fellow member of the covenant community, whose good was bound up with your own. This ethic was not about optional friendliness. It was a divine mandate. In fact, in a very real way, Jesus Christ would elevate it to the second greatest commandment, inseparably linked to the first. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. In doing so, he not only affirmed the command, but widened its scope, famously redefining the word neighbor in the parable of the Good Samaritan to include even the outsider, the stranger. For both Judaism and Christianity, the neighbor was not merely the one living in physical proximity, but the one whose needs God has placed before you. This biblical vision shaped the moral backbone of the West. In early America, neighborliness was not merely sentiment, it was a social necessity. The challenges of frontier life demanded cooperation. Building barns, harvesting crops, protecting against danger. Churches were often the first permanent structures erected, serving as places of worship. Community gatherings, dispute resolution, and education. So the moral expectation was that you would care for your neighbor, and this was reinforced weekly from the pulpit and daily in practice. History bears out the benefits of this cohesion. Sociologists speak of social capital, the network of trust and reciprocal obligation that allows societies to function smoothly. In communities with strong social capital, children are better cared for, crime rates tend to be lower, and families flourish in an environment of shared values. Small-town America, for all its limitations, excelled in this. The pace of life, the visibility of one's actions, the natural mingling of generations created a web of mutual accountability. If a boy was caught misbehaving, word would reach his parents before he got home. And boy, there would be a reckoning, but this was a moral good. It was societal accountability. If a family fell on hard times, meals would appear at their door without their having to ask. Urbanization changed this dynamic profoundly. Cities swelled in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Physical proximity increased, but relational proximity often decreased. I grew up in the suburbs of Kuala Lumpur, and for decades that we lived there, I couldn't even begin to give you the names of the neighbors who lived close to us, let alone tell you anything about them. Cities were like that. People lived closer together, but knew one another less. Apartment complexes and high-rise buildings concentrated humanity into tight quarters, but the churn of renters, the anonymity of crowded sidewalks, the absence of shared moral anchors, all of this weakens the neighborly bond. Suburban development in the post-war years promised to restore some of that community spirit, but its design often did the opposite, because the automobile replaced the front porch as the dominant architectural and social feature. Instead of walking to the local grocer and meeting neighbors along the way, families just drove to big box stores. Instead of gathering in the town square, entertainment shifted to private living rooms and increasingly to private screens. The built environment mirrored and reinforced a cultural shift toward individualism. In metropolitan and suburban cultures, the emphasis was on privacy, autonomy, self-determination. Fences and hedges marked property lines as clearly as unwritten social rules discouraged unannounced visits. Where earlier generations had experienced life as a series of overlapping communal circles, family, parish, neighborhood, town, modern Americans often experienced life as a series of compartmentalized spheres, rarely intersecting unless deliberately scheduled. And the result was, as you can expect, the weakening of the informal social infrastructure that has sustained neighborliness for centuries. Compounding this physical and cultural drift was also the decline of the church life in the West. Historically, churches were more than places of worship. They were the beating heart of local neighborliness. Weekly gatherings created regular face-to-face encounters. Families became family friends in churches. The liturgical calendar provided a rhythm for the whole community to live, to feast, to fast, to have festivals. And all of this reinforced communal bonds. Mutual aid was a given. Parishioners took care of one another as an extension of their Christian vocation. The church's teaching on charity was not abstract philanthropy. It was personal, incarnational service, visiting the sick, comforting the grieving, providing for the poor, all within our community. Why? Because they are our brothers and sisters and we love them. But as religious affiliation has declined, especially amongst the younger generations, these communal anchors have weakened or disappeared entirely. The rise of the nuns has meant not only a loss of faith, but the loss of the institutions that once naturally cultivated neighborly habits. As the shared moral and theological frameworks fade, so too does the sense of obligation that flows from it. Without the church as a training ground for the love of neighbor, the very concept risks being reduced to a vague benevolence without teeth or commitment, a footnote in American history. Some have hoped that civic associations, local government programs, or digital platforms could fill the gap. And such efforts can foster certain forms of connection, but they lack the moral imperative or relational depth that Judeo-Christian vision provides. Civic groups often rely on voluntary participation, and they struggle to reach those outside their immediate networks. Municipal programs may bring neighbors together for a time, but they cannot create the enduring covenant-like bonds that are forged in social worship and moral commitment. Digital communities are too often echo chambers. They connect the like-minded, but they leave physical neighbors as strangers. The erosion of neighborliness is not merely a sentimental loss. It has a tangible consequence for family and societal flourishing. Isolated families bear the full weight of childcare, elder care, and emotional support. Without nearby friends and extended kin, parents may feel trapped in cycles of overwork and exhaustion. Children grow up without the watchful eyes of a wider community to guide and protect them. Elderly residents risk loneliness and neglect. In short, the loss of neighborly networks leaves individuals and families vulnerable in ways that policy solutions cannot remedy. If there is to be a restoration, it must start where the original vision began. It must start in church communities. Churches are uniquely positioned to rebuild the moral and social infrastructure of neighborliness because they bind people together not merely by proximity but by shared creed, purpose, covenant. In baptism and membership, Christians publicly commit to bearing one another's burdens, to helping in the weight of the cross, to practicing hospitality cheerfully. And this commitment transcends political affiliation and economic status and even personal preference. It's grounded in obedience to Christ. Practical steps towards revival are within reach, my friends. Churches can intentionally design ministries that draw neighbors into a relationship. Block-level Bible studies, open-air potlucks, neighborhood service projects, but none of this will work if we all don't buy in together. Churches can reclaim public spaces for shared use. Community gardens, play areas, outdoor worship events, outdoor para-liturgical events. They can pair older members with young families for mutual support, re-establish intergenerational bonds, but most importantly, churches can model a counter-cultural vision in which people are not reduced to their utility or ideological alignment, but receive each other as image-bearers of God, worthy of love and service. And so to that end, I will say something that might jar all of us. But this is why juridical canonical parishes are a necessity. We ought to be going to the churches within our local canonical jurisdiction. These parish boundary lines are drawn for a reason. This is our covenant family. But these efforts will require persistence. We need to rebuild this, and it won't happen overnight. Long story short, we face a choice. We can continue down the path of privatized existence, or we can recommit ourselves to the ancient and ever-new command to love our neighbor as ourselves. And the road back will pass through the doors of churches, and in small acts of neighborliness, we can rebuild our community and human flourishing. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
This program brought to you in part by Ave Maria, Florida, a big kind of small town where golf carts take you everywhere and there's always something fun around the corner. Discover championship golf, resort-style amenities, and a town center full of shopping and dining. With Ave Maria University and Ave Maria Catholic Church at its heart, it's a community full of connection and charm. More than 25 model homes are available for viewing. More information can be found at AveMaria.com. That's AveMaria.com.
Underwritten in part by the following nonprofit.
Are you paying high prices with a traditional health insurance company that pays for things that violate your conscience? There's an alternative available. Solidarity HealthShare is a community of faithful individuals and families that never share into immoral medical services, all while saving you money with prices starting as low as $85 per month for singles and $512 for families. Never fund another abortion with your healthcare dollars. Call 844-313-4999 to learn more.
Hi, I'm Dr. Marcus Peter. Ave Maria Radio spearheads the proclamation of the gospel into all areas of society and culture. And so we want to invite you to think about what Catholic radio means for you. Because our towers and our equipment need updating. And we want to ask you to think about the impact of Catholic radio and how your donations can help continue the propagation of the gospel for the salvation of souls to all who hear it. Thank you for joining us on this wondrous mission.
Michigan's Catholic Biblical School Ministry unpacks every book of the Bible to deepen your relationship with God. Engaging talks from live expert teachers make reading the Bible a prayerful, inspiring part of our faith. These adult faith formation classes start this September in dozens of parish locations and online. Learn more at cbsmich.org. That's cbsmich.org.
Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. In what has turned out to be one of the most insightful history narratives, especially toward the time of Lincoln's assassination that I've encountered, Midnight on the Potomac has illuminated for me a lot of the undercurrents to the historical narrative behind that era in history that has paved the way for even the Union as we know it today. Joining me to have a conversation about the book is the author himself, Scott Ellsworth. Scott is, as one reviewer describes him, an historian with the soul of a poet. He is the New York Times best-selling author of The Secret Game, which was the winner of the 2016 Penn ESPN Award for Literary Sports Writing. He teaches at the University of Michigan, and he lives in Ann Arbor. Scott, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm just thrilled to be on Ave Maria in the afternoon. Thanks so much for having me, Marcus.
Well, the joy is completely mine, and this is the kind of conversation we have. I'm a student of history and literature, and, well, I guess any area of human flourishing is something I'm interested in. And I've been thinking a lot about the fact that next year our union celebrates 250 years of redefining what civilization can look like. And that's no small feat. As a professor, and also as the author of this book, which we'll go into greater detail, I wonder if you could comment on the fact that hitting the 250-year mark while maintaining a unity within the Union is an historically unprecedented reality.
Absolutely, no question about it. You know, for all of human history, every society had had a king or somebody who had more rights and privileges than anyone else. And then in 1776, a group of people in what is now our country, the United States of America, said there's another way to do things. Right. And while there are some kings today, there are very few have any real power. Mm-hmm. This was an absolute gigantic pivot in human history.
And in fact, considering what America achieved, what the United States achieved, we successfully redefined the way, like you mentioned, virtually every nation on the planet thinks about governance.
Absolutely, no question about it. This was, the founding of the United States was a sonic boom that was felt throughout the world, and its reverberations are still going on to this day.
And that's precisely why when we take a look at events like the Civil War, if you could paint it with broad strokes and just give us a context of the historical and political significance of the Civil War here in the United States, And then we should talk about the global implications that the Civil War had.
Certainly. So, to this day, the Civil War remains the single most important event in the history of the United States. It was, amongst other things, it was the bloodiest war in our history. 1 out of every 50 Americans died during the Civil War. The comparable number for World War II was 1 out of every 300. So every family, practically in the United States, lost someone in the war itself. It was also a war which, from the beginning to the end, 1 out of every 7 Americans went from being enslaved to being free.
Right.
This was also the first modern war in all of human history. It began in 1861 as a Napoleonic war with neat lines of infantry lined up, and it ends 4 years later in the trenches outside of Petersburg, Virginia, very much like World War I. It was also the first total war in that entire societies were mobilized into the fight. So while we often just focus on what goes on in the battlefield, the fact of the matter is women played a huge role on both sides of the war in terms of keeping money going into the family household, keeping the farm going, volunteering by the thousands in ways they had never done before. So the war itself, which lasted for 4 years, from 1861 to 1865, still has had echoes, today. It transformed the economy. With the death of slavery, we had to have a whole new kind of economy in the United States. And it also transformed our notion of freedom. Obviously, the war didn't solve all of the problems at all, but it was a gigantic marker in our history.
Scott, I wonder if you could also comment on, because I think this will benefit our listeners, the fact that the Civil War, whether one cares to admit it or not, is a direct overflow of those foundational anthropological principles you find in the Constitution and in the thought of the Founding Fathers.
Absolutely. It was also it was an attempt to answer the questions that they left unanswered.
Yep.
The reality is that all men are created equal is an absolutely astonishing statement, and one that reverberates to this day. But the fact of the matter is there was an asterisk by it, and the asterisk said does not apply to African Americans, does not apply to indigenous people, does not apply to women. So the aspirations that we originally had, we are still trying to meet up to them. And the Civil War was the great first leap from that.
And the asterisk was also within the thought of the Founding Fathers, because a lot of them condemned the institution of slavery despite the fact that great strides were only taken during the era of the Civil War. So looking at your book then, you focus on particularly 1864, you start there. And by this time, the socio-political milieu had been greatly affected by the events of the Civil War. I mean, you were seeing even towns and small groups divided along these loyalty lines.
Oh, absolutely. I'm one reason I wrote the book, Marcus, is I'm 71. I'm old enough to remember as a teenager, or young teenager, the late 60s and early 70s, and how divided we were. But it's nothing at all close to how divided we are today as a nation. And I thought, well, the last time we had been that divided was really in the 1850s and 1860s. Right. So I wanted to go back and look at that and try to understand what was going on, and also how, in the end, we were able to preserve our democracy.
Right. And in fact, I've seen some recent events in history, and I remember thinking the exact same thing. We haven't seen something similar to that, with the exception of the during the 1860s. So describe for us the social milieu, but also the political reverberations of the conflict at the time.
Sure. So, it's when we look back at history, we tend to think, oh, well, the Titanic was going to sink. That was, foreordained, things like that. But the reality of the Civil War, it was never preordained what was going to happen in the end. Now, the Confederate flag was never going to fly over Central Park or Boston Common or San Francisco, but the question was the Confederacy going to be able to survive as an independent nation, or was slavery going to continue in the United States? And that question was up in the air the entire time, and it was even up in the air as late as the summer of 1864. So you have a nation that has been, by that time, a nation that's been at war, bloody war for 4 years. People have lost their husbands, their fathers, their sons. The price of the war has been absolutely, horrific on both sides of the conflict. But there was certainly a feeling, in the North in the spring of 1864 that we're gonna win. That we have the ability now. We have the largest army ever assembled in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
It's been gathered in Northern Virginia. We have this incredible new commander, Ulysses S. Grant. We're now going to march. We're going to capture Richmond, beat the Confederate Army, and the war will be over by the fall. What happened instead is that the Union Army ran into a buzzsaw at these horrifically terrible battles in the wilderness in Spotsylvania. The Union Army loses 35,000 casualties. Nearly a third of the army is gone. And what happened was that instead of victory, there were death lists and casualty lists in newspapers across New York, and Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Detroit, everywhere. And there was a feeling that this is never going to end in the North amongst the loyal citizens, that we just need to let the South go. So it was so bad at that point, by the summer, that Lincoln was convinced that he was not going to be reelected, nor was anyone else of his advisors. So he was convinced it was all over. So that's how close we came.
We are talking with Scott Ellsworth. He's the author of Midnight on the Potomac. He is also a professor at University of Michigan. And we are talking about that last year of the Civil War, and that includes Lincoln's assassination and the rebirth of the United States. Continuing on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
Ave Maria School of Law is the Roman Catholic law school in the United States. Consistently ranked in the Princeton Review as one of the best and most conservative law schools, as well as pre-law's most devout law school. Ave Maria School of Law provides a traditional legal education while emphasizing how the law intersects with the Catholic intellectual tradition and natural law philosophy. Ave Maria School of Law, unabashedly Catholic, consistently excellent. For more information, visit avemarialaw.edu. For over 40 years, Leader Business in Ann Arbor has delivered top-quality copiers, printers, scanners, and software solutions, all backed by expert service. Rooted in faith and integrity, they ensure your operations run smoothly with fast response times and proactive maintenance. Join the many Catholic-owned organizations that trust Leader Business. Visit leaderbusiness.com or call 734-253-2534. Leader Business. Equip, serve, support.
Looking for a trusted contractor for your exterior home improvements? Call locally owned Mighty Dog Roofing today for a quote on roofing, gutters, siding, or windows. Mighty Dog Roofing uses premium products including Owens Corning shingles and James Hardy fiber cement siding, and they offer one of the best warranties in the industry through their OC Platinum Preferred status. Visit MightyDogRoofing.com today or call 833-MIGHTY-4. That's 833-MIGHTY-4.
Do you own popular index mutual funds or ETFs? If so, you're automatically own shares of companies that conflict with your moral beliefs. Ave Maria mutual funds are managed to conform to pro-life and pro-family values. Long-term investors can invest in the no-load Ave Maria mutual funds. The experienced professional portfolio managers make decisions based on investment fundamentals and pro-life values. You can learn more about Ave Maria mutual funds today at 866-AVE-MARIA or visit AveMariaFunds.com.
No one should ever have to choose between feeding their family and keeping their heat on. Impossible questions like rent or diapers demand answers every day, likely in your very own neighborhood. But you can help. Hope Clinic partners with you to provide free medical, dental, food, and behavioral health care, all in Jesus' name. While others face impossible choices, your choice is an easy one. Partner with Hope Clinic today. Find out how at www.thehopeclinic.org.
On the next Epiphany.
Hi, Vanessa Denha-Garmo here. Conor Gallagher will discuss his new book, Raising Blue-Collar Kids in a White-Collar World. And Father Gabriel Richard High School Principal Chris Dotson and Liz Schaefer will explain their new pilot program offering a Catholic high school education to students with cognitive impairments.
Epiphany, weekdays at noon on Ave Maria Radio.
Every woman deserves specialized health care. At Arbor Women Health, our team of compassionate professionals listen to our patients and want to understand what they're going through. They serve everyone from teen girls to seniors. Our faith-based clinicians specialize in obstetrics, gynecology, fertility awareness in crisis, or unexpected pregnancies. Call 734-930-4020 or visit arborwomenhealth.org. Arbor Women, faith-inspired, dignity-affirming healthcare.
Ave Maria in the Afternoon is underwritten by the following nonprofit organization: Real Estate for Life. Buying or selling your home or business property? Real Estate for Life can connect you with one of 1,400 pro-life real estate agents around the world. When Real Estate for Life receives a referral fee, they donate 70% to Ave Maria Radio and Human Life International. More information at realestateforlife.org or 877-LIFE-US1. That's realestateforlife.org.
Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm talking with Scott Ellsworth. He is the author of Midnight on the Potomac. I'd actually greatly encourage all of you to procure a copy of this if you haven't already. It's so crucial for us as citizens to be acquainted with the historical ebbs and flows of what led to the greatness of our nation and the arenas of our flourishing to this day. Scott is also a teaching professor at University of Michigan here in Ann Arbor. So, Scott, I want to pick up where we left off. You had just begun mentioning Ulysses Grant and the fact that Lincoln thought he wasn't going to be reelected. Of course, he couldn't see the future, and so he didn't know what was going to happen to him. But even before we get there, if you could talk about Ulysses Grant's military campaign and just, for want of a better term, it was a massacre.
Absolutely. You know, Grant was such an interesting person. We tend to think of our heroes as being just heroes. They were born to be heroes. You know, Grant had attended West Point, but he spent most of his time in the Academy Library reading Jane Austen and romantic novels. He served in the Mexican War without distinction. He was later sent out to Vancouver, Washington Territory. He lost all of his money in the gambling dens of Portland. He leaves the Army, and when the Civil War begins, his role in life, he's a clerk in his father's store in Galena, Illinois. He's a nobody. And when the war breaks out, the Union Army is so in desperate need of officers that he's recommissioned. He turns out to know how to fight, and then he solves in 1863 the great Battle of Vicksburg, which was a Confederate fortress in Mississippi along the Mississippi River. It had been the graveyard for thousands of Union troops trying to do this, and Grant figured out how to do it. And at that point, Lincoln realized this is the guy for me.
Right.
So, you know, he is now going to take this massive army to the south, runs into these horrible battles, you know, in the wilderness. It was just choked with foliage. Soldiers couldn't see 10 yards in front of them. Regular tactics wouldn't work. At one point, the woods caught on fire, so wounded soldiers were incinerated. Then a week later, at Spotsylvania, which is the great forgotten battle of the Civil War, you had the largest infantry charge in American history, 20,000 troops from 10 states with 101 battle flags go after this reinforced Confederate position. And what follows was 22 hours of the most brutal combat imaginable. A Confederate veteran from North Carolina said, pardon my words, but I'm not worried about going to hell because I've already been to a worse place. People fought with swords, with their fists, with rocks. And it just went on. And then there was more worse news that happened early that summer when a Confederate army under General Jubal Early slipped away from the Union, marched down the Shenandoah Valley, crossed the Potomac, invaded Maryland, and actually invaded the District of Columbia and came within hours of burning the White House and the Capitol. That didn't happen, but that was such a shock for the civilian population of the North that there was a feeling this just cannot go on. We've reached our breaking point, and we need to stop. And it was at that point that Lincoln's political future looked very dim indeed.
Unless you're a student of history, you also don't quite get a concept of what the Union was up against, even under Grant and Lincoln's leadership. In Chapter 2, the beginning part, Act 1, Chapter 2 of your book, you talk about the spycraft and the espionage and the even semi-guerrilla warfare that the Confederates were employing in the wilderness. Just give our listeners a concept of what they were facing.
Yeah, so what the Confederate High Command, Jefferson Davis and General Lee and others, realized by the spring of 1864 is that we can't win our independence on the battlefield. And because we can't fight a war of attrition against the more populous, loyal states and win. So, necessity is the mother of invention, and so what they launched was a long forgotten, frankly, terror war against the loyal civilian population of the North. And using lots of different means. There were plans to blow up the White House. There were half dozen or 8 or so Confederate agents who left Canada. They acquired some pyrotechnic devices, and the plan was to set New York City on fire. In fact, they set fires in more than a dozen hotels in New York that fall, and only just by luck they didn't burn down Manhattan. There were plans to try to create smallpox epidemics across the country. And so there were lots of things that the Confederates were trying to do, again, to neutralize Lincoln, either to kidnap him or kill him. But also they were trying to move the needle of public opinion in the North to get the northern citizens to realize this war has just been too costly. We need to let the South go.
One more thing I think we don't realize, like you mentioned, we whitewash our historical heroes so much. Lincoln underwent tremendous costs, emotional, psychological, his familial, his political career. If you could just shed some light on that, please.
Well, what I wanted to do with Lincoln was to really humanize him. We're all used to this stone figure that with just larger than life, and what the book begins with Lincoln's relationship with his youngest son Tad, and how much he and Tad were together. They were spent as much time as possible. Lincoln's bodyguard said that he didn't think that the president had had a better, more important relationship with Tad than anyone else. Lincoln suffered from lots of physical ailments. There's good evidence he was suffering from cancer during the last year of his war. And if you look at photographs of him, you can see how quick all American presidents age in office. But with Lincoln, it was just an absolute transformative, situation. And he really gave his life for our nation.
Considering that, like you mentioned, gave his life for our nation, in Act 2 you start really demonstrating the undercurrents that led to John Wilkes Booth doing what he did. One of the things that you point out very clearly is he wasn't an assassin of opportunity. There were very strategic substructures at play here.
Absolutely. As I got into researching this book, I realized that the version we've all been taught, or certainly I was taught, of John Wilkes Booth as sort of a sad, second-rate actor living in the shadow of his more famous father and brother, kind of a volatile, almost a prototype of a John Hinckley or a Lee Harvey Oswald. He wasn't that way at all. He was an absolute superstar of the American stage. He would sell out theaters across the country. Critics adored him. But he was also a racist and a white supremacist. He believed in slavery, and even though he grew up in a border state, he very much wanted the South to win. And it's very clear that by the summer of 1864, he was in contact with members of the Confederate Secret Service who had been plotting to neutralize Lincoln already, and in Booth they saw an opportunity for another weapon.
Scott, outside of reading your book, it's rare to find the narrative fleshed out that way. I wonder if you could comment on why that is.
Why we don't
know that much about John Wilkes?
Well, it's in part. There's two reasons. One is that the history of the Civil War and how we grew up to understand it changed about 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. In the early decades of the 20th century, there was a movement called the Lost Cause, in which Southern politicians and some Northern allies decided to rehabilitate the Confederacy. Mm-hmm. Jefferson Davis, Lee, Stonewall Jackson, they were no longer traitors. Now they're American heroes and things like that. And that plays into things. The problem was, what do you do with somebody like Booth? I mean, the idea of murdering somebody while they sat and watched a light comedy in a theater, you can't make that very easy to do. But it was actually through the works of amateur historians that I discovered this other story.
My guess is Scott Ellsworth. He's the author of Midnight on the Potomac. Essentially, the book covers that last year of the Civil War, Lincoln's assassination, and all of the undercurrents and substructures that lead to the nation as we know it today. We are continuing this conversation on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
In 2022, a brave young woman named Rima traveled to Ukraine to deliver medical supplies. She decided to stay, practicing combat medicine on the front lines. Join us on Sunday, August 24th at St. Francis Parish in Ann Arbor for a fundraiser dinner to buy medical supplies for Ukraine. Keynote speaker is Catholic apologist Joe Heschmeyer. To buy tickets or to donate, visit a2forukraine.com. That's a2forukraine.com.
Welcome to Advanced Dentistry Center family. This is Dr. Metti, and our team strives to treat you like family in a loving and compassionate way as we focus on serving you in a Christ-like manner. We do this by emphasizing prevention and general well-being for a lifetime. Our private practice is small, personal, state-of-the-art, and innovative, with the goal to educate and motivate our patients in improving their oral health. It is through a partnership with you that you will achieve the goals for your smile. Advanced Dentistry is serious about the level of care we provide, with attention to details and an exceptional level of care, skill, and judgment. We are thrilled for the opportunity to serve you.
Dr. Matty and the team invite you to visit them at advanceddentistrycenter.com or call them at 248-594-9592. That's 248-594-9592. AdvancedDentistryCenter.com.
Resetting your password, unsubscribing from emails, printing anything. Why are simple things sometimes so complicated? Thankfully, with an auto owner's insurance independent agent, getting the right coverage for your business doesn't have to be one of them, so you can get back to more important things, like learning how that printer works. That's simple human sense.
Call Choice Insurance Agency at 734-641-4200.
Honey, did you ever call Mighty Dog Roofing of Ann Arbor for that free roof inspection?
I knew I forgot something.
Roof leaks can cause mold buildup or even roof collapse. Protect your family today by calling local Catholics Dan and Mary Flanagan at Mighty Dog Roofing for a free inspection of your roof, siding, or windows. Mighty Dog Roofing, 734-224-4916. That's 734-224-4916.
Hi, I'm Dr. Marcus Peter. Ave Maria Radio spearheads the proclamation of the gospel into all areas of society and culture. And so we want to invite you to think about what Catholic radio means for you. Because our towers and our equipment need updating. And we want to ask you to think about the impact of Catholic radio and how your donations can help continue the propagation of the gospel for the salvation of souls to all who hear it. Thank you for joining us on this wondrous mission.
St. Therese once told her sister Celine that when we trust ourselves and not God, our soul becomes barren and incapable of virtue. Her remedy? External works of charity. We all try to do it on our own sometimes without asking for God's help. At St. Paul Evangelization, we suggest sharing the gospel with someone who needs it. Check out streetevangelization.com to find a team near you where you can share the love of Jesus. If there isn't one in your area yet, perhaps God is calling you to start a team in your city. To learn more, visit streetevangelization.com.
When the need for senior care arises, home is where the heart is. Visiting Angels provides home care for mom or dad up to 24 hours per day, including personal care, meals, and light housework. You may select your professional caregiver with Visiting Angels. More information at visitingangels.com or at 877-3 877-374-LIVE. That's 877-374-LIVE. Visiting Angels, America's choice in senior home care.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm talking with Scott Ellsworth. He's the author of Midnight on the Potomac. In this book, it's an outstanding historical inquiry into the undercurrents that played into that last year of the Civil War. And it covers the last year of the Civil War, Lincoln's assassination, the rebirth of America. Scott is also a teaching professor at University of Michigan here in Ann Arbor. Scott, we were just beginning to touch on the figure of John Wilkes Booth.
Right.
And if we can also expand from there to some of those things about Lincoln's last year that we don't seem to talk about very much. For example, the kidnapping plot that went awry. I think if you're a real student of history, you might hear something about it. But if you could just present to us all of those things that were happening in Lincoln's life that essentially led to his assassination.
Right. So there were multiple attempts on Lincoln's life. There was a former school teacher in Georgetown in Washington, D.C., who became a very effective spy for the Confederacy. And he stalked Lincoln for some time. He would hang out in Lafayette Park right across from the White House. He would note when Lincoln would leave the White House, often to go to the soldiers' home, which was in the northern part of the district and higher ground. And as some of your listeners know, Washington, D.C. in the summer is a swamp. And he would plot it. And they had an entire plan that they were going to capture Lincoln because, believe it or not, there was no real Secret Service in those days. And Lincoln would ride alone on horseback for several miles across the District of Columbia on nearly a daily basis. Mm-hmm. So there was that. We know of one occasion on an evening when Lincoln was riding to the soldiers' home that as he neared the entrance that a shot went off. And a shot went through his top hat within inches of killing him. Yeah. We know of other plots that were planned. Again, I've mentioned there was a plan to blow up the White House. The Confederates were very good at explosives. They exploded some ammunition barges in City Point, Virginia, killing more than 300 workers and soldiers. They were ahead of the time in creating landmines, which were known as torpedoes. And near the end of the war, a former Princeton and Columbia chemistry professor who was a Southerner who fled south during the war was developing poison gas. So they were looking for all sorts of ways to get ahead, and certainly getting rid of Lincoln was high on their list.
Considering that, like you've mentioned, Lincoln's life was in trouble, his political career was under severe attack. Talk about his re-election.
Well, what saved him were a couple of things, but most important, he was saved by one of the most fascinating characters of the Civil War, which is William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman had been, a banker in San Francisco before the war. He had taught at a military academy in Louisiana, but he was a man that was troubled by many things. He at one point considered committing suicide, and he ended up getting his legs under him. He turned out to be a brilliant soldier, but in the fall of 1864, Sherman captured Atlanta, and that was a great boost to the morale of the United States. I talk about how when that happened in the Hudson Valley, for example, in all the cities and towns, people shot off cannons and fireworks. People in Washington, D.C., hundreds of workers would go into the churches to pray and to sing hymns. I mean, this was the juice that the North needed, and that really gave Lincoln some momentum. His political rivals dropped out, and the Lincoln campaign got going.
And just so our listeners are aware, this couldn't have happened at a better time because public sentiment was at an all-time low. Even within the Union, the spirit of loyalty toward the flag was waning. You talk about that in your book, so if you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, I mean, it was, again, if you can imagine, everyone on your block, everyone in your apartment building, everyone in your rural neighborhood, if you haven't lost a son, then your next door neighbor has, or they've lost a father or a nephew, whatnot. And it just seemed like the war was never going to end, that we would never get ahead. And by Sherman doing that added a great boost. And then Sherman did one of the most remarkable things ever. we think of the march to the sea as Sherman moves his army from Atlanta to Savannah as being mainly a story of destruction. It's not. Really, that's part of it. But it's really two other things. First, this is the first time a modern army had ever decided not to have supply lines, but to live off the land. Nobody had ever done that before. Sherman had studied the census agricultural tables for central Georgia. He'd looked at crop production. He realized his soldiers could live off the land, and that's what they did. But the march also became this march of self-liberation for tens of thousands of African-American slaves who attached themselves to Sherman's army. So while we think of the destruction, this is really a time of great liberation. And by the end of it, there was one Union soldier, I think he was from Wisconsin, who said that, by the time we got to Savannah, every one of us was an abolitionist. We all supported the end of slavery. So it was things like that that added new steam to the Union cause, the loyal American cause.
And so that raised up new faces, new voices, new names. Tell us about Henry Highland Garnet and his joining of
Henry Highland Garnet is a fascinating American hero, born into slavery, escaped as a slave, went to the North, went to New Hampshire, attended an integrated school there, which was burned down by foes of abolition, became a minister, a very famous African-American minister in New York, survived the draft riots of 1863, and he became the first African-American to speak in Congress. And his speech, if you look at it and look at the account, it reminds you of Martin Luther King or somebody like that. And he's creating a new vision of America, a new vision beyond the war where black people can be free as well.
In 1865, we also saw a little bit of an upheaval at the War Department, especially with Lewis Powell. Can you comment on how that event altered, or at the very least impacted, the trajectory of the war?
Well, certainly. I mean, now Lewis Powell, of course, was a Confederate grown up in Florida, fought in many of the battles of the East. He's captured at Gettysburg. He escapes, and then he becomes a secret agent for the Confederacy. And he almost killed Lincoln. We know that in January of 1865, he had hidden himself in some bushes between the White House and the War Department, had a revolver in his coat pocket, and was planning to shoot Lincoln once he left the War Department, where there was a telegraph room, to walk to the White House. But there was another man with Lincoln at the time, and Powell became worried that he was going to get caught, and so he didn't fire. But at this point, finally, Lincoln's bodyguards are so worried about Lincoln's safety that they're encouraging him to do something about this. But Lincoln was somebody who in the end didn't feel that anyone would actually kill him. He had belief in humanity.
Yeah, he did, and you really see that come out in all of his public statements, especially the resultant reality, because he knows about this near miss at the War Department, and so he eventually delivers his second inaugural. Can you please talk about how that speech virtually transformed the sentiment of the nation?
The second inaugural is, if not the greatest speech ever by an American, it's within the top 2 or 3. There's no question about it. I described the day. It was a horrible, rainy day. The sidewalks and streets were rivers of mud. Yet all of these people who are absolutely soaking gather outside the steps of the Capitol to listen to Lincoln's speech. And when he comes out, when he walks out of the Capitol to go up the podium, all of a sudden the heavens open up, it's sunny, and Lincoln begins to talk, and a hush falls over this crowd. They've never heard anything like this. Right. People are crying, they're sobbing, and it was the first time where African Americans were invited and allowed to come and hear a presidential inauguration speech. It gave a new vision for the country, a new way ahead, and it transformed. It helped to continue to transform the war from simply a war to preserve the Union to a war to end this unholy institution of slavery and give us a new beginning.
The second inaugural becomes that watershed event that showed the public, it turned public sentiment to realizing this wasn't just a socio-political military movement This was a moral movement.
Absolutely, no question about it. And and I invite your leaders. It's not very long. It's it's just a couple of paragraphs, and I invite you to read Lincoln's inaugural address. It's absolutely fabulous.
This might be I believe that there are certain speeches every American child ought to memorize.
Absolutely.
And certain things, and I right up there is Lincoln's second inaugural. I sincerely believe that. Now, from there, you get City Point. You get Lincoln and Grant meeting, and eventually the plans to take place at Petersburg. Tell us all about that.
Well, it was, by the time we're now in the spring of 1865, and we're still stuck, but that's about to end. Yeah. And again, what you find in this book are just you'll read famous people, but you also read about everyday Americans. And there was a young New Hampshire farmer's kid who had lied about his age, joined the Union Army at age 16. By 1865, he's 19 years old, and he leads the breakthrough in the line at Petersburg. And when that happens, it's all over. The line the Confederate line starts to evacuate. The Union troops pour in. They capture Richmond, and they also defeat Lee. Now, the war isn't over. There are still 100,000 Confederate troops in the field, but this is going to be this is going to be the great turning point of the end game.
We're down to 1 minute, and so just to very quickly wrap up, Scott, I want to say thank you. We have Dies Irae, and then after that you've got Easter week, which is about a week before his assassination at Fort Theater. Right. And even his assassination galvanizes the people down a course of solidifying this truth. Scott, thank you. Thank you so much for your time with us.
Thanks. I've enjoyed being here. Thank you, Marcus.
I greatly enjoyed this as well. My guest has been Scott Ellsworth. He's a teaching professor at University of Michigan, best-selling author, and the author of a new book called Midnight on the Potomac. This is a book that really in-depth inquires into the last year of the Civil War, Lincoln's assassination, and all of the subcultures and sub-events that took place, and that you and I ought to learn about and appreciate for the sake of our nation. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marcus Peter.